Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We are listening to Guarded Secrets.
Up next, a married man falls victim to temptation.
He had made a mistake, which I am sure a lot of people can identify with.
She offered him a wild side that he hadn't experienced. Then he vanishes without a trace.
He was there 1 minute and then gone the next.
For almost 20 years, the disappearance goes unsolved.
I kept that hope that maybe he would show up on my doorstep.
Until a tiny chip of paint tells of a terrifying ordeal.
It would drive me crazy to know what a murder victim goes through every time they're killed.
The Kennecott Copper Mine outside Salt Lake City, Utah, is known as the richest hole on Earth. And copper isn't the only valuable mineral.
They mine gold and silver, and they have very expensive equipment, that sort of thing. Theft is a big problem out there.
As a result, security is very tight.
You just don't go onto Kennecott Copper property without usually encountering security.
So when the security guard wasn't on duty in the guard shack on a winter night in 1991, it was unusual.
They went up and figured that he might be in the restroom, checked it out for a while. They went up and found his lunch was partly eaten. His hard hat was still there.
The guard, Brian Roof, was not supposed to leave the shack for any reason until the shift changed at 11 o'clock.
It was just a strange incident where he was there 1 minute and then gone the next, and there was no real explanation of why he was gone.
Snow had fallen just a few hours earlier, but there were no footprints around the shack. Brian's car was parked in a nearby lot, and there were no footprints anywhere near his car.
It looked like he might have just stepped outside the door and vanished, but it was in a very isolated area.
Inside the shack, everything was in order.
No sign of any foul play at all, no blood, nothing turned over or destroyed.
21-year-old Brian Roof and his wife Jennifer had been married for 2.5 years and had a 15-month-old baby. Work records showed this wasn't the first time Brian went missing. Just a few weeks earlier, Brian walked off his job and ran away to Las Vegas.
He felt a big burden to provide for us, especially with his second baby coming. He felt that burden and he was trying to get through school. And I know that finances worried him a lot. He felt bad that we had to move in with my parents at the time.
Brian spent 6 days in Las Vegas. When he returned, he was a changed man, and not for the better.
He was very cold and distant. A side of him I'd never seen before. He was very cold, bitter about certain things, finances, things like that, and just angry.
As investigators searched the guard shack for clues, the phone rang. The caller said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer.
She was surprised when somebody else answered the phone when Brian didn't answer. They told her at that time that they were the police and they were looking for Brian. She did tell them that she'd been talking to him around 6:30. He had told her that there's another employee coming, is how he termed it. Maybe he just had to go.
As soon as police got off the phone with Jennifer, the phone rang again.
The deputy again answered the phone call, knew it was a different female voice, and the caller told the deputy that her name was Jennifer Roof. Somebody was claiming that they were Brian's wife that really wasn't.
A missing man with 2 wives. Police knew right away it was going to be an unusual investigation. Shortly after Brian Roof's disappearance from his security job, 2 women called his work phone asking to speak to him. Each of them identified herself as his wife. The company's caller ID system revealed one of the callers was indeed Brian's wife, Jennifer. The other was 20-year-old Christy Bradley. She was married to Dale Bradley, who was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine and one of Brian Roof's co-workers.
So that's when they sent detectives over to Dale and Christie's house to find out what was going on.
Christie told police that she and Brian had become good friends and talked regularly on the phone.
Dale would have Christie bring dinner out to him, and that's how Brian and Christie met, is actually out at the job site when she would bring meals out to him.
When questioned about Brian's disappearance, Christie said she was home all day and hadn't seen him. Dale said he had been off from work and was running errands all day.
Dale Bradley said he was up at the University of Utah. When his car broke down, he called his friend, Bill Easton, who was down at a local bar here.
5 days after Brian disappeared, his wife Jennifer discovered a potential clue.
There were credit card bills that I had never seen before. We had not applied for them together. And also a phone bill.
Jennifer discovered that Brian was having an affair with Christie Bradley.
It was a double whammy to have him missing and then to be hit with such horrifying news that everything had been shattered. My whole life had been shattered. Everything that I had dreamed and hoped for was gone.
Jennifer also discovered that Christie was with Brian in Las Vegas a few weeks earlier. When confronted with this information, Christie admitted the affair to both the police and her husband.
She told me that she thought Brian was really nice. She thought he was cute. Dale was very controlling to her, and Christie didn't like to be tied down. Christie and Brian were able to talk to each other, and that's, I think, the reason for the phone calls to the guard shack between Christie and Brian.
But Dale insisted he knew nothing about his wife's affair when Brian disappeared. Dale had no criminal history, but the affair gave him a motive to harm Brian, so investigators got a search warrant for his car. It was checked for blood and gunshot residue,
none of which we found. We didn't find anything.
In addition, Dale and Christie Bradley agreed to take polygraph tests, and they both passed.
When they found out about the affair, I had heard they interviewed Dale and Christie, and Dale passed polygraph. And at that point, they kind of dropped his name from the list of suspects.
Meanwhile, investigators pursued another potential lead. 2 of Ryan's fellow security guards had been arrested for stealing from the mine.
They were arrested for stealing metals off of Kennecott property and pawning them in junk metal shops, for junk metal.
In fact, one of those guards was at the guard shack just minutes after Brian was reported missing.
Brian was one of those at the guard shack who reported some of these thefts going on.
But without Brian Roof's body, police had no proof he was dead. Officially, he was still a missing person. Shortly after Brian Roof disappeared, police uncovered a theft ring run by security guards at the Kennecott mine.
They were stealing anything that wasn't nailed down. They were stealing gloves, shovels, just any kind of equipment that you would find around a mine.
Police wondered if Brian might have stumbled on a robbery in progress.
So a theory came up that maybe these guys were stealing metals off of the property that night, and Brian had stopped them, and they killed him to cover up the theft.
But none of the other security guards could be linked to Brian's disappearance.
He basically was completely alone up there in the mountain, and it really concerned him that it was an unsafe area, that there were no cameras, no electric gates, no security systems like they had in the other gates.
Weeks and then months passed with absolutely no sign of Brian Roof.
It was an overwhelming fear. When I would be driving to work or driving to the store, it was just a constant cloud over me of fear that somebody could just disappear and never come back.
Brian's wife, Jennifer, was forced to raise their little girl alone. 6 months after Brian went missing, she gave birth to another daughter.
I I just couldn't move on. I was stuck in that realm of grief until I knew what had happened to him.
1 year later, hikers discovered human remains in a camping area about 50 miles from the Kennecott mine.
He still had his security outfit on, as you say, his wallet, everything intact.
That's him. Brian Andrew Ruff.
So I got a phone call from the detectives, and I asked him, I said, is it Brian? And he said, yeah, it's Brian. That's when my world fell apart.
Dental records confirmed the victim was Brian Roof. An autopsy showed he'd been shot 5 times in the back.
I thought that somehow he had gotten in the middle of something illegal and they killed him for that.
Search teams found 5 spent shells from a .22 caliber pistol near the body. Investigators believe Brian was shot just a few feet from where he was buried in a shallow grave.
The next day, they're out there working again, and one of the dogs from the canine unit recovers a boot, a black cowboy boot that was identified as Brian's work boot, that was recovered about 200 feet east of the gravesite. Never did find a second boot.
But so much time had passed and so much rain and snow had fallen that no other clues were found at the scene.
It's really frustrating. There's no other way to put it.
With no evidence to tie anyone to the crime, the case went cold, and the years passed. Until 14 years later, when Todd Park, a cold case detective with the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, received a telephone call from authorities in neighboring Carbon County.
When that call came in, it gave me a fresh breath of air to look at another case and to really dig into it.
Police in Carbon County were investigating Dale Bradley on the suspicion of murdering his second wife, Crystal. Dale had been a suspect in Brian Roof's murder 14 years earlier. On a hunch, Todd Park contacted Dale's first wife, Christy, who was now living in Texas.
So when Detective Park contacted her 14 years after the fact, she was surprised that the case hadn't been solved, because Dale told her somebody else had already been arrested for it, and she just assumed this case was done.
But that obviously was a lie. And Christy told police something she hadn't mentioned during the original investigation. She said the day after Brian went missing, Dale cleaned the inside of his car.
He had never cleaned out that trunk as long as she had known him, as long as he'd owned that Camaro.
Why would Dale do this? Police wondered if Brian Roof had been inside that trunk.
Was the blood? Was he shot in the car and wrapped in a blanket and looking for trace evidence, looking for blood in the car?
But after 14 years, could police find Dale Bradley's Camaro? "14 years after Brian Roof's murder, and investigators never lost hope they would solve the case.
The thing about Brian, he was a very good kid, and he was a very good father, and regardless of the affair, I think he was a very good husband. He just had a lot going on, and I think he would have been able to really make something of his life and his family if he was able to continue on in life, and that was cut short.
When investigators heard that their original suspect, Dale Bradley, was now a suspect in yet another murder investigation, they decided to look once again at the evidence. And this time, on Brian Roof's boot, the one they found in the mountains near his burial site, they spotted something, some kind of scuff mark on the bottom of the boot that looked like reddish-orange paint.
When I saw that swatch of paint, it just flashed back to me that was the same color paint that was on Dale Bradley's car. And I got excited and I kind of got a little bit of butterflies and I thought I got him.
Forensic analyst Bill Schneck examined this paint with a stereo microscope.
And I noticed it was a smear. It wasn't like paint chips that were adhering to the boot. It's actually smeared into the leather at the bottom of the boot. There was tremendous force to get that paint smear onto his boot.
Was it the kind of force caused by trying to kick your way out of the trunk of a car, for example? Bill Schneck needed to know if the makers of Dale Bradley's Camaro had painted the inside of the trunk. Luckily, Schneck had a friend who restored old cars.
They just happened to have a 75 Camaro when I was there. So we popped the trunk, and indeed they have original paint in the trunk. So that was useful.
Dale Bradley drove a red 1974 Camaro at the time of Brian's murder. The mission now was to find it.
I spent a lot of hours searching for that car. They went up in an airplane and searched high and low for that car. Through a lot of investigation, found that the car had been sold.
Unfortunately, 2 years after Brian's murder, the new owners sold the car for scrap metal.
That car was scrapped. I mean, it's just a little case. It's been melted down.
But an examination of the case file revealed a surprise. 14 years earlier, an alert detective had taken paint samples from Dale's car.
We just took them. It's hard to say why. We just took them, because there wasn't really much else to take. Those paint samples just sat in our evidence room for years.
Bill Schneck took paint samples from the boot and the car and placed them on slides with an immersion liquid. This eliminated any air trapped between the sample and the slide. Using a polarizing light microscope magnified up to 1,000 times, Schneck saw the paint was a lead chromate paint.
I wanted to go back and find out how unusual is a lead chromate paint. And I contacted the National Institute of Science and Technology and received a paint chip non-standard from the 74 Camaro.
Using a scanning electron microscope, Schneck now did a three-way comparison. He examined paint from the boot, from the car, and from the file sample of a 1974 Camaro. All were identical.
Paint on the boot came from that particular car or another car having those exact same properties, composition.
And with this evidence, Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Roof's murder.
It was shocking that anybody could do something so horrific, let alone somebody that claimed to be a good friend.
Prosecutors believe Dale either knew or strongly suspected Brian Roof was having an affair with his wife, Christy, and was afraid she was going to leave him.
I think that he was so angry that Christy and Brian betrayed him that he was going to make them pay.
The forensic evidence suggests Dale's plan was to eliminate the person he perceived to be his competition. Since he knew Brian's hours and when there would be the least amount of traffic, he knew exactly when to strike. Dale probably forced Brian into the trunk at gunpoint. Brian tried to kick his way out of the trunk during the 30-minute drive when a piece of the paint became embedded in his boot. When Dale got to the burial spot, prosecutors said he ordered Brian to remove his boots so he couldn't run away. He then forced him over to a shallow grave, which prosecutors think he dug earlier that day. then shot him with a .22 caliber pistol. The murder weapon was never recovered.
It was so typical of Dale's personality to be a coward enough to shoot somebody in the back and not face him when he was going to take his life.
The paint and circumstantial evidence were difficult for Dale Bradley to refute. He agreed to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter and kidnapping and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. What Bradley didn't realize was that Brian's boot held an important piece of evidence that told the story.
This cold case was solved because of that paint chip.
It makes me want to go out and look at every single case and examine every piece of evidence to see if there's something that I can do with it. It motivates me to solve other cases.
Dale Bradley remains a suspect in the murder of his second wife. It's ironic in a way that Brian Roof's desperate efforts in the trunk of Dale's car resulted in the capture of his own killer.
Just one little thing, that's all it takes. In this case, it turned out to be the paint samples, coupled with all the circumstantial evidence in this case and the physical evidence that you have. That was just the clincher in this case.
Well, even today, though, there's a lot of detectives that are just focusing so much on DNA, they're forgetting all the other avenues that could be approached with trace evidence, such as paint examination.
I hope it sends a loud message that there is forensics out there, that people who are willing to continue to look at these cases, that you're not going to get away with murder. And that the more they try to cover up some of their tracks, the more tracks they leave.
Up next, 3 college students are murdered. It looks as if one person had killed them all.
He picked on young women, picked on pretty women.
Police immediately have a suspect.
In law enforcement terms, it's almost like winning the lottery.
But not everyone was convinced he was the one.
If he's going to brag about 3, why not 4?
You mentioned all the other cases, but never mentioned Susan Shoemaker.
For 20 years, questions remained until decades-old evidence reveals the terrible truth.
It's a horrifying thing to think that there's more than one monster in your community at one time.
It was a week before the fall semester began in 1981. Susan Shoemake moved back to the campus of Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. She was anxious to start her senior year.
She had just gotten a job at the radio station, and she was going to be doing some of the broadcast work.
So she makes section 3, description, narration, and dialogue.
On August 17th, Susan left the radio station just before 6 p.m. She planned to meet her girlfriend for dinner, but she never arrived.
The friend who she was supposed to have supper with called her roommate, Mary. Mary did not know who she was at. Later into the night, approaching midnight, they started calling all their friends. They went to places where they thought she might have gone.
The next day, with still no word from Susan, the police were notified. That night, officers noticed some trampled vegetation near a dirt footpath students used to walk from one side of the campus to the other.
As he walked into the weeds a little deeper with a flashlight, the weeds were quite high. It was very difficult to see. Then all at once he saw Susan's body.
This was something that really undid us. It was obviously a horrible thing, and I immediately started crying. It was a very terrible moment for me.
It appeared that Susan had been beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Police assumed the crime occurred just after Susan left the radio station between 6 and 6:30 p.m., which meant she was abducted and attacked in broad daylight.
This was in the middle of the day that this happened. And I think that was one of the more scary things to people, is that it was so random.
Police asked anyone who might have seen anything suspicious to come forward. They also interviewed all of Susan's friends, including her past romantic relationships.
There had been a few people who had attempted to date her that she had denied, so they, of course, became part of a growing suspect pool.
Police also had to consider whether the perpetrator was a stranger.
Because of the location of the murder and its accessibility to a number of dormitories, they were looking at dormitory lists and who lived in the area.
She was such a blameless victim. The thing that we're all afraid of is some monster coming out of nowhere and snagging someone we love, or snagging ourselves. And that's what happened to Susan.
Then police learned of a remarkable coincidence. On the day Susan was murdered, a subcontractor working on the new campus gymnasium had employed a man who'd been a suspect in 2 murders. Both victims were students at the university.
He was within 300 or 400 yards. You got to remember, he's working on a campus where there are 8,000 or 9,000 pretty girls walking around every day. The investigators of that day figured that if a woman was raped and murdered, he's the one that did it.
Within days of Susan Shoemake's murder, John Paul Phillips topped the list of suspects.
He was known around town as kind of a hellion. I met him early in his life. He was a terrible temper. I met him when he was 15 or 16 years old in a fight. He tried to beat some kid to death with a baseball bat.
Phillips had been a suspect in the rape and murder of 2 other Southern Illinois University students 5 years earlier. 21-year-old Teresa Clark was found raped and murdered in her apartment off campus. At the time, John Paul Phillips lived in an apartment about 100 feet away.
We worked that case to death. We didn't have any fingerprints. DNA was way in the future. We had no witnesses. We didn't have much of anything going. But we felt pretty comfortable he might be our person.
1 year later, 24-year-old Kathleen McSherry was also found raped and stabbed in her apartment. Again, John Paul Phillips lived in the neighborhood.
Again, no DNA, no fingerprints. No, where's John Paul now? Well, it turned out he lived just a few blocks north.
There had been insufficient evidence to arrest John Paul Phillips for either murder, but in Susan Shoemake's murder, police finally got a break. At Susan's autopsy, the medical examiner found 2 foreign hairs on her body, presumably from her killer.
One was a body hair, one was a pubic hair that was recovered from Susan's body.
Phillips willingly provided hair samples for comparison. Based on microscopic examination, Phillips' hair was not similar, so he was eliminated as a suspect. Despite the hair analysis, Susan's family was convinced that John Paul Phillips was Susan's killer.
And they didn't take Phillips into custody at the time. They didn't arrest him or charge him, which I didn't understand at the time, because I thought that they had enough reason to.
Later, Phillips committed several assaults that landed him in jail.
He went out to the Devil's Kitchen when he spotted a young lady and her boyfriend at one of the campgrounds. Approached him with a gun. He went over to Carterville and kidnapped the girl too.
But police finally got a break in Susan Shoemake's case. First, they found Susan's yellow backpack in the Piles Fork Creek behind the dormitories. Her wallet was missing. Friends said she usually carried about $10. And a campus worker found a small red bag with some toiletry items not far from where Susan Shoemake was murdered. Inside, police found some identification.
He finds a pharmaceutical bottle that has the name Daniel Willison, but it was prescribed at the Menard Correctional Center.
They did some checking on him and found that he was on parole, and so he became a person of interest.
21-year-old Daniel Willison had recently been released from prison for a burglary conviction. He was a handyman working on campus at the time of the murder.
Daniel was working at the Quad Apartments
which is probably about a quarter mile away from the crime scene.
When questioned by police, Willison said he had an alibi for the night of Susan Shoemake's murder, that he was with a friend.
And the officers took him to the various locations trying to find this person with whom he spent the night, were unsuccessful.
Willison cooperated with police and provided hair samples. But the next day, when police went to speak with him again, he was gone. In his room, they found a torn note. Some of the pieces were in the toilet. The rest were in a trash can.
It read almost like a suicide note. I don't know why it's always me. I know I can't handle prison again. I know everybody's better off this way.
Police continued to search for Willison until they examined his hair sample. Willison's hair was not consistent with the hair found on Susan's body, so he was eliminated as a suspect. The case threatened to go cold until John Paul Phillips, now in prison for rape and kidnapping, allegedly bragged about his murders to his prison cellmate, Thomas Mockabee.
One day in the cell, he relates all these crimes that he committed to Thomas Mockabee and provides detailed information about these murders, detail that only the killer would have known.
Phillips provided details about the murders of college students Kathleen McSherry and Teresa Clark, but also confessed to killing a third woman, a waitress, Joan Weatherall. But he never mentioned Susan Shoemake.
If he's going to brag about 3, why not 4?
He never mentioned Miss Shoemake, but the conventional wisdom back then was that he was responsible.
Police believed that John Paul Phillips killed Susan Shoemake too. But if they were wrong, a murderer was still at large. In November of 1986, John Paul Phillips went on trial for the murder of Joan Weatherall, one of the 3 murders Phillips allegedly confessed to during a conversation with his prison cellmate.
In fact, when we were done, the judge said, I'm not satisfied he did this one. I think he put on a good enough case. I could convict him for the other 2. Judge said that in open court.
On the day he was sentenced, Phillips addressed the court.
He said, well, I didn't kill her, but I hope she felt every bit of it. And the judge immediately sentenced him to death. And he went off to prison on death row.
But before the sentence was carried out, he died in prison of a heart attack at the age of 40. Although Phillips bragged to his prison cellmate about killing 3 women, he never mentioned Susan Shoemake, but her family still believed he was responsible.
We thought that Phillips was the murderer, and he went to jail, and he died in jail. So my family consequently thought, well, this is done. It's over, he's dead.
Others weren't so sure. For one thing, Susan's murder was different from the others.
Most of his murders were under darkness, and that wasn't the situation with Susan Shoemake. Minor maybe, but just enough that it didn't quite seem right.
Lieutenant Paul Eccles was Susan's classmate in college and had kept a picture from her case file on the desk.
Now you could just look at that picture. You could see that this was a happy moment. Father standing with his daughter, very proud. And knowing the story that I knew by that time that she had been murdered, it was something that always held my attention.
By the year 2000, almost 2 decades after Susan's murder, a new DNA process called PCR made it possible to test a small biological sample, where in the past, much larger samples were needed.
Essentially, that process is just Xeroxing DNA. So we're just copying the specific portions of DNA that we're interested in analyzing.
So analysts tested the small biological sample taken from Susan Shoemake's autopsy and were able to identify the DNA profile of the killer.
Yeah, we're in the game now. There's a good chance now we'll be able to figure out who killed her.
John Paul Phillips' DNA sample was not on file, so investigators took the extraordinary step of requesting that the state exhume his body.
They wanted to eliminate him as a suspect, and they needed to get his DNA in order to do that.
A DNA sample was obtained from Phillips' bone marrow. It did not match the DNA from the crime scene.
I called and spoke with Susan's mother. It was a very emotional phone call. She cried as we talked. It's obvious that you never forget the death of a child like that. And she was very disappointed. But, I tried to assure her that we would continue to go forward and try to identify the suspect.
I was angry at the time when this happened because, and probably on a subconscious level, because I felt we had closure it was done with.
And there was more bad news. The DNA did not match anyone in the statewide database of known criminal offenders.
So we knew it had to be somebody who's never participated or contributed to the CODIS database.
If the killer wasn't Phillips, or anyone who committed a felony before the DNA database was created, then who was it?
And where do we go from here? And the obvious answer is, let's dig back into the case and let's see who else was a suspect in those days. Who else can we get a DNA standard from? Let's just keep going until we run out of suspects.
The first person on their list was Daniel Willison. He was originally a suspect. He was working a quarter mile away on the day of the murder. Then he ran off when police tried to question him. Police found him in Michigan, where he worked at an auto salvage yard. By this time, he was divorced with one child and did not want to talk with police.
Willison told them that he had to provide hair samples and fingerprints back in 1981. He was not interested in cooperating with their investigation.
Investigators wanted a DNA sample. Willison refused to provide one, and the courts refused to order one, citing the lack of probable cause. Willison's hair was on file from the original investigation, but the samples didn't contain root material, so they couldn't be used to generate a full genetic profile. So investigators decided to try an unconventional method to get Willison's DNA. It had taken a long time, almost 20 years, and Lieutenant Paul Eccles was convinced he was closing in on Susan Shoemake's killer. But only DNA could prove it, and the suspect, Daniel Willison, wasn't willing to provide it. So Michigan State Police decided they'd take his DNA in a perfectly legal manner.
They decided to run surveillance on him. The whole purpose was to try to get something that might have Daniel Willison's DNA so we could either identify him or eliminate him.
It wasn't easy. Since Willison worked in an auto parts salvage yard, only other employees could get close to him without arousing suspicion. Then police learned he had recently sold his car, and they knew he smoked cigarettes. So they traced the car to its new owner.
They asked him about the cigarette butts in the ashtray. He says, well, I don't smoke, and all my friends throw their cigarette butts out the window. So these were like when I bought the car.
There were more than a dozen cigarette butts. Police hoped at least one was from Daniel. They gave the evidence to DNA analyst Jennifer Andrew.
What I gathered from speaking with the investigator in charge, there was a homicide about 20 years ago of a college student, and me being recently out of college, it was a little bit personal for me.
One by one, Andrew cut open the cigarette filters, often a good source of DNA.
Because that's where all the saliva and skin cells would be deposited.
The samples were treated with a solvent that separates the DNA. A profile was generated from an unknown male.
People think the job is so cool. It's actually very, very stressful. And it's moments like this that really make it worthwhile.
The profile was sent to Illinois for comparison with the 20-year-old genetic material left at Susan Shoemake's murder. And it matched Daniel Woolison.
Well, ecstatic, of course. I mean, this is, in law enforcement terms, it's almost like winning the lottery.
Naturally, Lieutenant Eccles would need another DNA test to confirm the DNA results from the cigarette. Until then, Eccles wanted to prevent Woolison from fleeing, so he tried a ruse. He confronted Woolison with some made-up evidence.
It was important for me to extract some type of information from him that would give me enough to get him arrested. I gave him the story about the witness, which is not true. I tell him that there was a person that he worked with at the Quad Apartments who had stepped forward and had seen Daniel Woolison walking down a path behind the right one, carrying a yellow backpack during the evening that she was murdered. And I took it just a little bit further and told him that I had a fingerprint that was identified to him from that backpack. And then immediately, without me saying a thing, he said, "You know, I only took $10 from that backpack." I knew he was telling me the truth.
It was pretty much a sunk puppy there.
So Woolison was arrested, and he was forced to provide an additional DNA sample. That test left no doubt he was the source of the DNA found on Susan Shoemake.
I knew enough about DNA evidence to know that the odds of there being a mismatch is, it turned out in this case it was going to be 300 million to 1 was the most conservative estimate.
Prosecutors cannot fathom the reason for Susan Shoemake's murder. They believe Woolison saw her walking alone along the dirt path, and he decided to attack her. It was late in the day. No one heard or saw anything. He left behind his DNA, then took her yellow backpack. Stole $10 from her purse, dumped it in the creek, then dropped his bag with a pharmacy prescription not far away.
It's that randomness that's so frightening. She wasn't stalked. She wasn't selected. She just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Despite the evidence against him, Woolison pleaded not guilty. In March of 2006, 25 years after Susan's murder, Daniel Woolison was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The university has now built a well-lighted pedestrian overpass so students no longer have to walk through the overgrown dirt path where Susan was abducted and murdered. It was named in Susan's honor.
My wife had made the comment. She said, I wonder how much it cost to have one of these overpasses built. And I said, I'll tell you what it costs. It costs one human life.
That's why we do what we do, to bring justice to these families. So the families deserve a lot of credit as well. They're the people who push us along the way.
I went back to the site again after the trial. It had been beaten there by quite a few people. There were flowers and balloons. Obviously, a lot of people had thought that they needed to go to that site. It was overwhelming.